All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the absolute pleasure of talking to Jeremy Paden. He's the author of The World is Sacred Burning Heart. Before I introduce you to Jeremy, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you to Jeremy Paden. Jeremy was born in Milan, Italy, and raised in various southern states of the United States and in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic. He obtained his PhD in Spanish from Emory and teaches Spanish at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. He's the author of 3 chapbooks of poems and 1 chapbook of translated poems. He has also translated 3 full-length collections of poems from Spanish to English. In 2020, he collaborated with the illustrator Anne Hermosillo and his co-translator Osvaldo Estrada to publish Under the Ocelot Sun, a bilingual illustrated poem about the Central American migrant caravans, which won an Ada Campoy Prize for Spanish language children's book by the North American Academy of the Spanish Language. His most current books are World is Sacred Burning Heart from Taos Press and Self-Portrait as an Iguana from Valparaiso, USA. Self-Portrait is a bilingual collection of poems written in Spanish and translated into English, which co-won the first Poeta en Nueva York Prize by Valparaiso, USA Press. So Jeremy, welcome to Poet to Poet.
Thank you, Rod. It's an honor to be here.
So the poems in the book that we're going to talk about today, World is Sacred Burning Heart, spring from a rich confluence of sources. Where did the book start for you?
Well, my PhD work was in 16th and 17th century Spanish and Latin American literature. And so on the one hand, it's been a long time coming. And not only has it been a long time coming, but I want the first poem, the book was published, and here I'll show a little picture of it. The book was published in 2021, but the first poem that I published from it is a poem called Kipu, and that was published in 2009. So the actual building of the book took well over a decade. And as I mean, and it started in my day job. I teach things like Latin American civilization and Latin American literature, and so often with juniors and seniors, we will read from the breadth of Latin American history and Latin American literature, sometimes diving into things like Pablo Neruda's Canto General, oftentimes looking at the paintings of Diego Rivera, of Frida Kahlo, and other such painters, and talking about them and analyzing them. So on the frequently, my job is engaging in these topics, and I had begun, and this was in concert with a trilogy written by Eduardo Galeano called "The Memory of Fire," that does sort of little vignettes of Latin American history. One iteration of of Latin American civilization was reading from that trilogy, and in reading from that trilogy, I started responding to Galeano's own works with poems of my own, and a handful of those, Kipu being one of them, a poem about a Nahuatl creation myth called The Turtle Like the World, came from teaching that class. And as I was writing those, other things were happening in the early teens. Among them, the reconsideration of Columbus and Columbus's position within U.S. culture, and so this reconsideration on a popular level, which had been going on an academic level for a good number of decades, um, gathered my interest, and I began to write poems um, based on various conquistadors.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I imagine your personal background, having grown up in landscapes that were implicated in Spanish colonialism, um,
Yes, after,
influenced the development of these poems. So maybe could you tell readers, watchers, a little bit about what you see as the central themes of the book, and how those relate to your background?
yeah, I think probably I'm not probably. I mean, for me, it's a central theme is colonialism and what colonialism does, um, and it's extractive economies and what extractive economies do to culture, and um, power, and the way that power speaks to itself and justifies itself to itself, and the way that power speaks to those um, it's working to oppress, and the way that power, oftentimes as it's justifying itself, will confess unwittingly to the most horrendous kinds of crimes. And so those are some of the major themes, and how that connects to my own background. When I was 7, our family moved to Nicaragua, and this was in 81, and the Sandinistas had just overthrown the U.S. sponsored dictatorial family of the Somozas, and right around 80, 81, the Reagan administration had begun to sell its weapons to Iran to fund the Contra opposition. And so there were a couple of things that I remember as a young child, hearing and seeing wars and rumors of wars happening. We lived in Managua. Most of the conflict was out in the northern mountains, but we saw the army everywhere, and we heard of the things that were going on along the northern border. So on the one hand, there was that, and observing that, but also I remember one of the things that the Sandinistas did was really kind of revamp um, education. They they worked hard to sort of bring literacy and widespread literacy to the country, but along with literacy, brought with them, in terms of their education, a different focus on uh, Spanish colonialism than previously uh, found. I mean, there are ways that in Latin America you can, or you could oftentimes speak of the the colonization of the Americas in the same um, kind of heroizing narratives that we get in our own country. The City on the Hill, the Pilgrims, that's certainly an Anglo thing, but within Latin America, the positive thing would be the Crusades, the conquest, the conversion of natives. Um, but I remember this would have been in second grade, seeing the history books that we had, and they didn't hold back in terms of recounting the kind of violence that the Spanish conquistadors meted out on the native populations. And one of my earliest memories of being in Nicaragua was seeing um, these stories that recounted the violence of colonization.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, all of that to say, while this is not, one would read this and not think it to be an autobiographical book. I think in real ways it is. It's very much tied to my having grown up in Central America and in the Caribbean, and my having um, lived and traveled through those spaces.
Mhm.
In fact, I remember in the Dominican Republic, right, one of the places that you go when you're visiting Santo Domingo is the Alcázar de Colón, Diego Colón's, and he's the son of Christopher Columbus, Diego Colón's home there on the banks of the Osama River. And so this history of colonialism is one that I grew up with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like we said before, we hit record, oftentimes poetry, literature, these spaces that we create on the page are ways to tie those threads together, right? All the sort of, again, the confluence of our personal history, the resources and the textbooks and the recordings, like you said, responding to Galeano's work. Um, there's a beautiful way in which there's a crystallization of that process of sifting through all of those different influences, if you will. So, would you like to read a poem
Yes.
to give folks a taste of this because it's just so wonderful?
So shall we start with this map?
Yeah, that would
Or
be great.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, one of the there along with the themes of colonialism, and this will be seen certainly in this poem. Um, the book itself has a series of poems that are that sidle up to persona poems in the voices or almost in the voices of various conquistadors, and it also has another class of poems that are largely ekphrastic poems on 16th century maps. And 16th century European maps of the Americas and of the world as it is being discovered and conquered by Europe are really fascinating objects where what we see is concrete evidence of all of these utopian dreams and dystopian nightmares and um, hopes and expectations and myths and legends all put on paper. Um, and sometimes it's hard to determine whether or not the people who are making these maps know that they're playing with fiction, or if in fact all of this is itself believed. And this map is an ekphrasis after Visconti Maggiolo's 1531 Portolan planisphere, and a Portolan map is in fact a map that would have been used by um, captains as they sail. A Portolan map is a map that's going to chart the various ports where you can go, and Portolan maps have compass roses positioned throughout across the map with rhombus lines so that a captain using an astrolabe to look at the stars and the position of the stars, and then using a compass can begin to plot latitude. They
Mm-hmm.
can't plot longitude because longitude um, really isn't. I mean, they know, but they don't know longitude, and it hasn't been discovered and or invented until the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
So they're able to know and determine well where they are in relation to the equator, but it's a lot harder to determine where they are in terms of an east-west
Mm-hmm.
uh, kind of movement. And I'll say one other thing about this map. Um, this is a map that when you look at it and you look at North America, there's running through the middle of North America is this giant sea that isn't there, but um, a sailor well before a decade or so before Maggiolo makes it uh, is convinced that he saw an inland sea. And there are then further sort of repercussions of this all the way up into the 19th century. Um, right when Thomas Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark on their journey to exploring the West, one of these reasons is to find the Northwest Passage. This sea, this is is sort of the beginning of this legacy and this myth about a Northwest water passageway that is going to allow one to quickly circumvent the new continent.
Yeah.
So
Fast.
this map, after Visconti Maggiolo's 1531 Portland planisphere. Ships sail willy-nilly on this map. Ships sail on this map upside down and backwards. No ship on this map flies a skull and crossbones. No ship has grappling hooks out on this map. That absence does not mean these ships aren't piloted by pirates. On this map, a Nina, a Pinta, and a Santa Maria bob on a phantom sea. On this map, a phantom sea stretches from the Carolinas to Wyoming. On this map, the Carolinas do not exist, and if Wyoming existed, on this map it would sit between Angoulême Harbor and a compass rose. On this map, in the bulge of Brazil, cannibals feast on shipwrecked sailors. On this map, the Nile is born in the mountains of the moon. On this map, a lapis and emerald globe is set into the bulge of West Africa. In this globe, the West Indies and the East Indies are one. In the East Indies, herds of unicorn prance and frolic. This map has renamed every cape and bay and river from Tierra del Fuego to the lands north of Labrador. This map portions out the earth to the kings of Portugal and France and Spain. This map fizzles into regions marked lands unknown.
Thank you. That's um, such a great example of the work that this book is doing. So maps appear throughout the book, these different artifacts, if you will, and so do dreams, right? So and we're already sort of in this poem sensing that there's a reality maybe that's somewhat described, and then there's this wishful thinking, right, or this dream that's
Yeah.
in this map. Um, so in a way, I think the maps represent a kind of dream, right? The dream of an idealized place. And the dreams that occur throughout the poems in the book are also like maps because they point the characters toward particular desires. And the book as a whole is a kind of map through a territory. So, how do you think about the territory of the book and how these motifs interact within that space, literally and or metaphorically?
Well, that's no, that's a great question. Um, in I mean, I think to add to that, writing poetry is oftentimes an entering into a dream space. And and trying to follow a dream logic that establishes connections and that moves one through sometimes spaces that are comforting and sometimes spaces that are terrible and terrifying. Um, and in terms of the book itself, um, I mean, as we've talked about, I started writing poems. Excuse me, I started writing poems about colonialism, about colonization. Some of these were based on cultural artifacts. Some of these are based on um, the stories of conquistadors, and some of those stories of conquistadors had to do with remembering how, when we lived in the States as a young child, how Columbus was spoken about, and the fact that I mean, when we though I was born in Milan, Italy, we moved to Rome, Georgia when I was 4, and so I did my kindergarten and first grade in Rome, Georgia, and right down the road, I mean, a couple of hours is a place called Columbus, Georgia, and right north is Columbia, South Carolina, and there's a Columbus, Ohio, and there are a number of Columbus and Columbia counties, and the way Columbus was presented in the 70s was very much as a hero, as a romantic hero that and this is based on the Hollywood movie where he sails to prove that the world is round rather than flat, when in fact everybody knew in 1492 that the world was round. The dispute hadn't anything to do with whether or not it was flat or round. It had to do with the size and had to do with whether or not Columbus's math was wrong or was incorrect, and it was or was wrong or right, and it was actually terribly off. But I won't go into that. Um, so right, there are these different different discourses happening in the culture at large about who the conquistadors are, and whether they're virtuous and whether or not they are heroes to whom we should look up, or whether they are um, villains. And as I was thinking about that difference between how I was raised, at least in the US, and then this reconsideration of whether or not we should celebrate something like Columbus Day uh, was taking place in the writing of this. Um, one of the things that I realized was that my writing of these poems that are reconsidering who um, who the conquistadors are and what the process of colonization was isn't just an exercise in history and an exercise in really sort of arcane and outdated history, but is in fact an engaging with the present reality of these Americas. I mean, right as even as Columbus um, is being decapitated, or the statues of Columbus are being decapitated in 2019 and 2020, right? This is responding to the violence against Black and Indigenous peoples and against uh, Latinx and Asian peoples in this country. So part of my understanding of this space is that we enter into um, history through a couple of poems, and at the beginning that open us up into this space and wander through um, essentially a chronology. I mean, because the captain poems start with Columbus, and as the captain figure changes, we're actually moving through chronological time all the way up until we get to um, Cabeza de Vaca and Las Casas, who are sort of the last. I mean, in terms of time, the yeah, I go up to the mid um, 17th century. And so one of the things that we're as we're moving through time, I'm looking at ways in which um, these various figures excuse what they're doing um, and celebrate who they are, hopefully using irony as a way to undercut the authority that they ascribe to themselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds so incredibly, what do I want to say, logical, right? This progression that you're describing in the book. But I'm curious in terms of your process. You mentioned writing poems are kind of like entering a dream state. So, so the book didn't present itself. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong in
No,
assuming that, but tell me, yeah, tell me more about like entering the dream state and how a single poem for you emerges.
um, most of the time, a poem will start with a flash. It's either an image or a line, and um, and I'll follow that for a bit to see if anything is there. Um, and not always, I mean, I write in a lot of different ways. There are times when I write on my walks. So I oftentimes do about a 5 mile walk. And as I'm walking, um, I'll work a poem over in my mind, and and oftentimes by the end of the walk I've only got 2 or 3 lines, and
Mm-hmm.
I'll jot those down and come back to them. With some of these though, I had gotten into the habit of waking up every morning around 3 or 3:30 and and just writing for about 2 hours or so. Um,
So before you've entered your day, before the sort of logic of whatever it is you have to do
yeah,
in your life takes over. Yeah.
yeah, and I think I mean there's a way in which both of those, both the walking, which is you have this repetitive movement that is rhythmic as well, um, and helps push away distractions. So there's a way in which one enters into the rhythm of the walking, and the body and movement frees the mind to play. But then the other one would be in the early morning, not just before the day has begun, but really when I'm still barely waking up, and the clouds of sleep and dream are sort of still there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and with these poems, I'm thinking specifically about the captain poems. Um, what I wanted to do, and this wasn't an intentional thing. It was only after a series had been written that I realized, oh, this is what I'm wanting to do. I was wanting to use in English a language that that was similar to the strange kind of language that you get in the early 16th century. And it's a language that this is a moment of transition in Spanish, moving out of the sort of um, old Spanish and a whole bunch of Latinate terms. I mean, neologisms are coming back in, and so there's this whole bit of experimental language that's happening in the early 16th century. But only a handful of the conquistadors are university trained. And so what you get is this sort of hodgepodge of um, some people who dominate elite language well, and some people who just have things they have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll run long run-on sentences, much like I do when I'm in an interview. Long run-on sentences um, that that use a mix of scientific, or what at the time would have been scientific language, and popular language as they're trying to make sense of the reality around them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the captain poems, in terms of language, are in part trying to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I decided, and this was more in revision than it was in the process of writing, um, was to begin to use a little bit more hyperbaton,
Mm-hmm.
so syntactical rearrangement of clauses, um, to add a kind of strangeness
Mm-hmm.
to the language, in part because 16th century Spanish does that a lot, um, and in part to keep this world that the book creates a little strange and a little off kilter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, you feel that reading the poems, that there's this sense of um, you know, the language is echoing that intersection of different, like you said, the cultural changes that are happening um, in Spain, and in this whole situation with the conquistadors. But then when you get to the New World as well, you're bringing in the languages of the native peoples into the book. So could you say a little bit about how, it feels very natural to the book, but there's a lot to consider when we are bringing in terms
Right.
from other cultures and other languages. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, and there are ways in which in English we don't recognize some of the neologisms that we use in our own, or some of the loan words, in fact, that we use in our own language. So that hammock, uh, that lovely um, thing we use to sleep in, comes from the Taino language, through Spanish, and the language, the Cayman for the American alligator also comes from the Taino. Chocolate comes from um, the the Mayan and the Nahuatl word for this drink. So the one of the things that the book does, it uses Quechua at times, it uses Mayan, and it uses Nahuatl at times, and um, there are moments when these are used to refer to the natural world, and in part because Europe didn't have words for things like iguana. Europe didn't have words for things like chocolate. It didn't have words for a host of animals. Um, and so that's one of the class of words that I'll use from foreign or first languages. Um, but another one is oftentimes family relations.
Mm.
So that there are two poems in the voice of um, 16th century Nahua women, one being Malintzin or La Malinche, and one being Tequixpotzin, and she was the daughter of Moctezuma. And both of those poems refer to family relations, husband, wife, father, mother, child, using the Nawa, um, because that's the way, in part, that we do. I mean, my I was born in Italy. My father was born in Italy, and so we referred to his parents as nonno and nonna. My mother was born in Puerto Rico. Her mother was Puerto Rican, and we didn't refer to her as abuela, but her name for us was Ita, which is the diminutive attachment that you put to abuela. You say abuelita, and so that was that shortening, and so she was Ita to us. Right, family relations are oftentimes um, words that are kept in the original.
Yeah.
And so that was some of that thinking.
Yeah. Well, and I'd love to have you read the Chocolatl poem, and I'm probably not pronouncing it the way that you would in Mayan, so you'll correct me.
No,
But
chocolatl is good.
but um, but I think what occurs to me with a word like that is that you're actually pointing out the assimilation that has happened, right? So it's not so much to grab and use something from the Mayan language, but to say, hey, look, here's this, here's how it came to us, right? Um, so yeah, would you read
Yeah,
little?
and yeah, that's another thing, that there are poems in here that play a lot with etymology and definition of words, and this is one of them. Chocolatl, Tlaloc's brew. Your name is lost in bitter struggle. Bean toasted, tribute offered to flower warriors, Tenochtitlan's dark currency, Quetzalcoatl's gift. You sit bright on the tongue, taste of lost paradise. Hot liquor, chocolatl, mixed with chilies, draught of the gods, elixir of those sent off to meet the morning, drink offered to Cortes as welcome cup. And yeah, so in this poem, chocolatl is the title is in Nawa, and then when it comes up again as chocolatl, it's in Mayan. And etymologists have a dispute over over what it means, over its origin, but yes, the majority consensus is in fact that chocolatl in Nawa is actually referring back to the chocolatl in Mayan, um, and that the Mayan uh, culture and practice of growing chocolate and drinking chocolate would have been something that then the the Aztecs or the Nawa picked up.
Mhm, mhm. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, so the book contains a lot of uh, amazing notes in the, amazing in terms of the depth of, so I just want to sort of show readers, uh, in order to read with some intelligence these poems, there's a great deal of um, background information and sort of knowledge that can, I mean, certainly the poems stand on their own, but as we, talked a little bit before we hit record, your intention with this book was to provide not only these beautiful ways to enter into these ideas and these landscapes and again the confluence of culture, but to also provide readers with a sense of um, how to keep exploring and the background.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you thought about that in terms of the book, and then how you were able to find a publisher that was willing to work with you to maintain that dual purpose of the book.
Well, I guess I'll flip it ar around a little bit, mainly because so very appreciative of Andrea Watson and Leslie and the whole team at 3 at Taos Press, and how much care they put in in the book, and in the design of the book, and then in letting the book have extensive notes on the poems, and um uh a little sort of essay that situates the cover of the book and explains it within the context of the poems themselves, and then um a several page bibliography that hopefully will help people who are interested kind of follow up more on um, the colonization of the Americas, and that history. And it was, um, yeah, it finding Taos was, or finding 3 at Taos Press um, was a real godsend that came through um, signing up to do the Tupelo Press revision workshop that they hold in Taos. And so in the fall of 2018, I had, well, in 2017, 2018, I had been generously given an Al Smith grant from the Kentucky Arts Council that afforded me the ability to go to this revision workshop held by Tupelo there in Truchas, New Mexico. And there, I worked with Veronica Golos, who is a 3 at Taos Press author, and who writes poetry based on history. Her book Rooted is an example of that, and there was a way in which what I was doing in World of Sacred Burning Heart was similar. It's the use of poetry as a space to think about history and to rethink history. And and there was an affinity there between our work, and she is an acquisitions editor, and brought it to Andrea, and Andrea was really excited about it, and we spent then about a year working together, because among the things, I mean, in terms of writing, one of the things that I had done was, in one version of this, there was a lot more maps, and one of the things that I did is I would write poems on maps, um, and I was informed that that was going to be a little too a little too difficult and a little too cost prohibitive, and it wouldn't translate well into the book form. But one of the things, though, that Leslie did, and that I don't think would happen at another press that's not 3 at Taos Press. Not only did she use this cover, but she then incorporated images in from the cover as sort of section breaks throughout the book, um, and I think that really helped add not just a visual element to the book, but it helps add a rhythm to the collection as a whole.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It certainly helps the reader feel immersed again in that territory, in the wider map of what the book is doing. So it's just beautiful. It's a wonderfully designed. Yeah, I mean, I hope that we'll put a picture of it up with the interview, but I just like holding 3 Taos Press books. I
Yeah.
like holding them. I like reading them. I like reflecting on them. They feel like, they can sit on your coffee table, but they also sort of, I want to say they sort of soak into you or penetrate your psyche in a different way because of
Yeah.
how it's designed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is such rich material that without, you know, I think we can get, again, each poem stands on it on its own. We can get a sense for it, but it's all these pieces together within the structure of this beautifully designed book that just it creates a whole world. So, and that's
And
thanks to you as well. I mean, you know, I appreciate that you're giving credit to through Taos Press, but it's that finding the right fit,
yeah,
that that the magic happens there.
yeah. Well, and I mean, and it does, again, the thing through Taos Press's praise one more time. Um, there is a way, I mean, I appreciate what you've said about about the poem standing on their own. I do. Um, but I also acknowledge that this is a book that demands a lot from its readers, um, and asks readers to, probably to sit with
Mm-hmm.
some discomfort, not just, I mean, discomfort in terms of the images, but discomfort in terms of wondering, you know, where in the world am I?
Yeah.
Uh, and the notes and the bibliography at the back, um, I think, do help situate uh, a reader in the space and in a place so that the poems can, um, hopefully, instruct as well as delight, to use an old medieval idea about what poetry should do. And having a press that will take, a gamble on that, and having a press that will back a book that, that believes, I mean, and this is something that you've already said, but that believes in the power of poetry to, um to bring a lot of disparate things together. Um, there is, I hope, lyricism in the language, but, they're not necessarily your traditional lyric poems of the sort of autobiographical self singing about, um, the emotions and thoughts of the self. But I mean, I think poetry, if you go back to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, or Lucretius's, um, On the Nature of Things, this is philosophy being written in and through poetry that's actually poetry. Or Dante's Divina Commedia is theology, uh, being written in and through poetry. Um, I think the the world of poetry is much more expansive than we oftentimes, um, at first blush, think it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always say to my students that, I mean, in any poem that you read or any book that you read, there's a challenge and there's a permission. You know, as a writer, reading as a writer,
Yeah,
there's often a challenge that's presented to you in a text, and there's a permission. And I think those things are often the same thing, right?
yeah,
So to me, in your book, you know, that challenge of putting oneself in the uncomfortable position of taking in all of the many threads and all of the many sources together, and how, like you said earlier, you feel off kilter, right? That's going to put you off kilter the same way that traveling to a new landscape puts us off kilter, right? But in
yeah,
a sense enlivens us. It wakes us up. It points to, just as a philosophy does, or a religious text, it points us into, um, it eliminates the dark spaces in our psyche. And so that's just what I appreciate so much. The permission being, one can do this.
Yeah.
One can sit down and from the knowledge and the experiences and the research collected, produce a work that allows for a reader to enter into that territory in a really meaningful, profound, and beautiful, right, lyric way.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say to folks about this book and why it's such a special um, thing to read. So why don't we to end maybe just end on a poem? Would you mind?
Okay. Yeah.
So let's hear when the captain sleeps. Just
Yes.
back to the captain and the dreams.
This is yes, it brings together captains and dreams, and it's the last of the captain prose poems. And when the captain sleeps, he sleeps not the sleep of the dead, dreams not with angels slight as mist that descend the golden steps to administer soul salve. When the captain sleeps, he sleeps with one eye open, and should luck visit, should both eyes close and he fall deep into slumber, he will walk the house in dreams to lock and relock doors and windows, to wrestle with spirits whose names he claims he's never known. But if he'd listen to the voices of the dead that speak in the blood that runs through his veins, he'd know this sleepless vigilance, so close to that hate that turns inward and against the self, but shows itself as gun aimed at another's chest and fired, is the price paid for being captain. Could he hear his grandfather's father speak, he'd learn of another too green in keeping men by force to work the cane fields. Stories whispered in smoky rooms ever since Wolof fires burned fields and buildings one Christmas dawn on some forgotten island. And he'd know his sleep, sorry, and he'd know his sleepless sleep, his fighting off of ghosts, is the poison gift given him as birthright. But to hear this curse would mean to hear the song of eastern facing shores that also course through him like the currents of the North Atlantic. And he would know himself mongrel and see his father as the thief he fights night after night.
Beautiful. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been such a pleasure to get to enter into this book again with you and in this conversation. Um, how can people find you if you want to be found? Website?
I do have a website. It's a curious little uh, thing that I'll send the link to you and you could put it. Is that possible? I mean, it's what is it? It's I want to say J Paden at Wix or something like that. I'll send it to you. But I'm also on Facebook and I'm on Instagram and on Twitter, though I hardly ever venture into the Twitterverse. And on Facebook, I'm just Jeremy Paden. And on Instagram and Twitter, I'm Jeremy Day, which is Day is my middle name. And I'll send you all of those links.
And we'll put it in the show notes for people to find easily. And of course, I want to encourage everyone to go and purchase a copy of the book. I know it can be ordered directly through Taos Press.
Correct.
Also be ordered through bookstores and online booksellers
Yeah.
choosing. So just an encouragement to go and get a copy and dive in and enjoy this incredible book.
Well, and Rod, I wanted to thank you for your generosity and also just the deep and generous reading that you gave the book. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.